What makes a tennis player truly terrifying? Is it the shots they hit or the feeling they create the moment they walk on court? Jimmy Connors, a man who never gave anything away easily, was once asked to name his all-time greats. He chose two players in his entire career. One was Pancho Gonzalez, the other was Ilie Nastase. His talent, his ability, his movement, everything was there to make him the best and the greatest. The first world #1 in ATP history, over 100 career titles, but the numbers only tell half the story. To understand why players feared Nastase, you have to understand what he could do with a racket, and in the 1970s, he was doing things nobody else could. Tennis historian Bud Collins, who watched every major player of that era up close, put it simply: there wasn't a shot he couldn't master in a well-rounded all-court game. That was not a compliment you heard often. Most great players had a weakness, a surface they avoided, a shot they patched over. Nastase had none. He could stay back and grind from the baseline. He could rush the net and finish with a volley. He could do both in the same point, switching between the two the moment he sensed his opponent had read him. What made it worse for opponents was the combination of speed and spin. The ATP's own records describe him as possibly the fastest player of all in his prime, a player who was expert at putting the ball just beyond an opponent's reach and applying discomforting spin. That phrase, discomforting spin, matters more than it sounds. On the wood rackets of that era, generating heavy spin consistently was genuinely difficult. Nastase did it naturally, and he used it to pull opponents wide, drag them into positions where no good reply existed. Željko Frnulovic, who lost to Nastase at the Masters in 1971 and later became tournament director of the Monte Carlo Masters, made a point that still frustrates those who knew Nastase's game. People remember his crazy antics, but not his talent. He was one of the most talented ever. To understand why players feared Nastase, you have to understand what he could do with a racket, and in the 1970s, he was doing things nobody else could. Tennis historian Bud Collins, who watched every major player of that era up close, put it simply: there wasn't a shot he couldn't master in a well-rounded all-court game. That was not a compliment you heard often. Most great players had a weakness, a surface they avoided, a shot they patched over. Nastase had none. He could stay back and grind from the baseline. He could rush the net and finish with a volley. He could do both in the same point, switching between the two the moment he sensed his opponent had read him. What made it worse for opponents was the combination of speed and spin. The ATP's own records describe him as possibly the fastest player of all in his prime, a player who was expert at putting the ball just beyond an opponent's reach and applying discomforting spin. That phrase, discomforting spin, matters more than it sounds. On the wood rackets of that era, generating heavy spin consistently was genuinely difficult. Nastase did it naturally, and he used it to pull opponents wide, drag them into positions where no good reply existed. Željko Frnulovic, who lost to Nastase at the Masters in 1971 and later became tournament director of the Monte Carlo Masters, made a point that still frustrates those who knew Nastase's game. People remember his crazy antics, but not his talent. He was one of the most talented ever. There is a difference between a player people respect and a player people cannot look away from. Nastase was the second kind, and his peers knew it. Jimmy Connors spent years competing against Nastase at the highest level. He also partnered him in doubles, winning 2 Grand Slam titles together. When Connors looked back on his entire career and named the players who genuinely stood apart, he did not hesitate. My 2 all-time greats were, #1, Pancho Gonzalez. The other is Ilie Nastase. But what Connors said next is the part that reveals something deeper about what Nastase did to a tennis tour. Watching him play, he was one that every match he played, every player would watch him play. Think about what that means. These were professional athletes with their own matches to prepare for, their own opponents to study, and yet when Nastase walked on court, they stopped and watched. Not because they had to, because they could not help it. Part of that pull was technical. Nobody knew what shot was coming next. Part of it was theatrical. Nastase treated every court like a stage. But part of it was something harder to define, a presence, the sense that something was about to happen that you would not see anywhere else. Documentary co-director Tudor Georgiou, who spent years researching Nastase's career for the 2024 HBO documentary, described it this way: Nastase will go down as one of the first superstars of professional tennis. He brought both humanity and comedy to sport and helped it to grow. The shots were dangerous. The presence was suffocating. But what made Nastase truly difficult to face was something that happened before the score even mattered: the systematic destruction of an opponent's concentration. Nastase had a full toolkit of psychological weapons. He would mimic his opponent's service motion mid-match. He would stall between points until the other player's rhythm was completely gone. He would quick serve, sending the ball across before his opponent was ready. He would argue with line judges over calls that were clearly correct, not because he believed he was right, but because the disruption itself was the point. And he was honest about it. When asked about his approach to competition, Nastase did not pretend otherwise. "I was always rather nasty. I was willing to be friends with the devil just to cross the bridge." He also understood the connection between his own emotional state and his performance. "As long as I can get angry, then I play well." What made this particularly difficult for opponents was the absence of any rule book to protect them. In the early 1970s, tennis had no formal code of conduct. There were no penalty points, no penalty games, no structured system for dealing with a player who treated the rules as a loose suggestion. Nastase operated in that gap with complete freedom. Dick Stockton, who faced Nastase at the American Airlines Games in 1976, spoke to reporters afterward with the exhaustion of someone who had just survived something he had no preparation for. "It's hard to play when a guy is doing the things Nastase does on the court. He did everything to win the match in an unfair way." The tactics went beyond the court itself. At Roland Garros, Nastase once arranged for a black cat to be released onto the court mid-match, having learned beforehand that his opponent was superstitious. On another occasion, American player Clark Graebner became so enraged by Nastase's behavior that he jumped over the net and grabbed him by the shirt. Nastase immediately declared he was too frightened to continue and defaulted the match, turning the aggressor into the victim in a single move. In November 1975, at the Masters in Stockholm, Ilie Nastase did something that had never happened before in professional tennis. He pushed his opponent so far that the man who was winning picked up his rackets and walked off the court. That opponent was Arthur Ashe. Nastase was trailing and growing more agitated with each game. He began arguing with officials and heckling a spectator in the crowd. Then he started mimicking Ashe's service motion, stopping, resetting, pretending to serve, stopping again before looking across the net and asking repeatedly, "Are you ready, mister?" Ashe? Ashe was one of the most composed players in the history of the sport. He had faced pressure of every kind, on and off the court. But this was different. At a certain point, he simply put his racket down, gathered his things, and left. He explained his decision plainly. "I've had enough. I'm at the point where I'm afraid I'll lose control. I'd rather lose the match than my self-respect." Referee Horst Klosterkemper, who was standing courtside, later described the moment he had been preparing for all evening. "I had made up my mind to disqualify him, Nastase, but I had no chance because Arthur Ashe left the court." It was the first time in the history of professional tennis that both players in a match were disqualified. A committee met the following day and awarded the victory to Ashe. What happened afterward is less known. Nastase went to a florist, bought a bouquet of flowers, found Ashe alone at dinner, and said, "Please forgive me, I forfeit the match." Years later, every time Nastase saw Klosterkemper, he would say the same thing: "Thank you for disqualifying me, because from that moment on, I concentrated on my tennis." Ashe, for his part, never stopped trying to make sense of the contradiction. He eventually settled on 4 words to describe Nastase's words that captured something no statistic ever could: a walking paradox, an incredibly gifted and devoted athlete who somehow can lose from 5 to 2 and 40 love. It is impossible to fathom him. The Stockholm incident did not fade quietly. It forced a conversation that tennis had been avoiding for years about what the sport would and would not tolerate from its players. In 1976, the ATP introduced the Code of Conduct. For the first time, players could be formally warned, docked points, docked games, and ultimately defaulted from a match for behavior on court. The system that governs professional tennis today, the one applied to every player at every level, was written largely in response to one man. Court umpire Jacques Dorfman, who officiated matches throughout that era, wrote about it directly in his memoir. A player like Nastase is probably no stranger to the arrival of the code of conduct and its evolution. The rules did not stop Nastase immediately, but they changed the environment around him. What had once been tolerated as entertainment now carried consequences. Nastase himself, speaking decades later at the Cannes premiere of the documentary about his life, acknowledged the shift with characteristic honesty. Today, it would be impossible to do what I was doing then. That single sentence carries more weight than it appears to. It means that the version of Nastase who dominated the early 1970s, the one who bent matches to his will through chaos and psychological pressure, could not exist in the modern game. The sport had to change its rules to contain him. In the autumn of 1977, a little-known French player named Georges Gauvin walked onto a court in Paris and defeated Nastase using a racket strung in a way nobody had seen before. The strings were doubled, loosely layered on top of each other rather than woven together, creating an unpredictable spin that made the ball behave like nothing opponents had trained against. Players called it the spaghetti racket. Nastase was furious. After the loss, he told reporters, "It's the first time I've played against someone using one of those things. It's also the last." Less than 2 weeks later, he changed his mind. Facing Guillermo Vilas in the final in Aix-en-Provence, Nastase walked onto court carrying a spaghetti-strung racket of his own. Vilas, at that point, had won 53 consecutive matches on clay, one of the longest winning streaks in the history of the sport. The ITF had already voted to ban the spaghetti racket. The ban was scheduled to take effect the following Monday. The final was played on Sunday. John Fever, who had faced the racket earlier that season, described what it was like to play against it. "You don't know what's going on with the bloody thing. You can't hear the ball come off the face. It looks like an egg in flight. When it bounces, it can jump a yard this way or that, and up or down." Vilas retired after losing the first 2 sets. The streak was over. As tennis historian Bud Collins recorded, Nastase vowed he would never play against it again, but the following week used it himself to end Vilas's long winning streak. By 1979, Nastase was 33 years old. The titles had slowed, but his ability to turn a tennis match into something unrecognizable was still fully intact. In the second round of the U.S. Open, he faced a 20-year-old John McEnroe in a night match before 10,000 spectators. What followed was described by those present as the most chaotic match in the tournament's history. Nastase lost the first 2 sets and began to unravel. At one point in the third set, he walked to the baseline and lay down, pretending to fall asleep. The chair umpire issued a warning, then a penalty point, then a penalty game. Nastase still refused to play. The referee stepped in and defaulted him. The crowd did not accept it. Spectators began throwing cups and cans onto the court. Fights broke out in the stands. Police and security were called. The chaos lasted 18 minutes before tournament officials made the decision to reinstate Nastase and replace the chair umpire entirely. McEnroe, who would go on to become the sport's next great antagonist, watched it all from the other side of the net. He recalled the moment he walked into the locker room afterward, ready to confront Nastase directly. Nastase followed him in and spoke first. "Right. Where are we going to dinner? I've met these 2 girls." McEnroe also noted in his autobiography that the 2 men did, in fact, go to dinner together that evening. He added one final detail, that Nastase was the only person in his life he ever allowed to call him macaroni. Before Wimbledon in 1972, Fred Perry, a 3-time champion at the All England Club, pulled Nastase aside and told him something that turned out to be both advice and prophecy. "If you can beat yourself, you can win Wimbledon." Nastase lost the final in 5 sets. It is the sentence that defines his career more than any title or ranking. He had the technique, he had the speed, he had the shots that made opposing coaches lose sleep at night. What he could not do, consistently, was get out of his own way. Jimmy Connors, who competed against him for over a decade, described it with precision. He would just kind of go off the map and kind of lose it, and once he lost it, he couldn't get it back. And yet Nastase understood the game at a level few players ever reached. He knew exactly what it required. He said it himself. The player who wants to conquer the summit cannot afford to be kind. He must want to kill. He believed that. He lived parts of it. But the same intensity that made him terrifying on his best days was the force that pulled him apart on his worst. That is the contradiction at the center of Ilie Nastase. Not a player who fell short of greatness, a player who knew precisely what greatness demanded and burned it down anyway.